for their support for this conference. In particular, Mary Heffernan, Miles Campbell, and sadly, Miles was supposed to be here, so I'm a poor stand-in for Miles, but Miles is joining us online, so he's unwell, so we wish him well. So thank you to the team at Dublin Castle and Christiane Began, and our tech team, to Leanne and Katie. So we're just really thrilled to have this lovely space to avail of. This conference is organised by Gallery of Photography Ireland in partnership with Creative Centenaries and the Nerve Centre as part of our year-long survey of photographic practices in Ireland. As an arts organisation primarily focused on contemporary practice, we wanted to take this opportunity to present the first comprehensive survey of photographic practice in Ireland from 1839 till now. And so it's a year-long programme. It started in Dublin Castle, and we're about to launch our third chapter this afternoon in the gallery. So you're very welcome when we finish here around 3:30, 4 o'clock to join us over in Gallery of Photography in Meeting House Square for the opening of that exhibition. And rather than simply outlining the canon of photography, what we wanted to do was to consider the role of photography in shaping cultural identities on the island of Ireland to better reflect issues of equality, diversity and inclusion. So we're delighted to have this opportunity to bring together leading historians, academics, artists, archivists, curators from across the island of Ireland, the UK, and also to welcome Pauline Vermeer, who's come from New York. So thank you very much for joining us. Today we'll be starting with the first panel, which is chaired by Tommy Graham, and I'm going to hand over to Niall shortly, and Mark Seeley will be joining us online. Thank you to Niall, Creative Centenaries and the Nerve Centre. We've had the pleasure of working with you since 2018 on a broad range of artist programmes around the borderlands in Northern Ireland, and we're looking forward to continuing to collaborate with you on that. And finally, we'd like to thank you all for coming. You can hashtag in our own image, and just to alert you to the emergency exits. There's 2 doors there, and there's another exit here as well. If you need to use the bathroom during the presentations, we'd ask you to use the bathrooms in the basement, and you'll probably get lost, but it's very fun to wander around this beautiful Georgian building. Otherwise, if there's no one presenting, there are bathrooms through here as well. So I'd like to hand over to my colleague for this, Niall Kerr, and thank Niall for his hard work in this and putting it all together. Thank you, Niall.
Trish. My name's Niall Kerr. I'm the head of heritage with the Nerve Centre in Derry. It's a creative media arts centre, and we work across music, education, film and creative technology. And one of the aims of the organisation is very much about issues of heritage and good relations. And through that work we've sought to develop new ways and models of working and exploring our past and giving voice to new audiences and people. And one of the projects that we've done that through has been Creative Centenaries. And Creative Centenaries is a project that started in 2013 as a public-facing engagement platform around the Decade of Centenaries, specifically for Northern Ireland, and to act as a hub of information, events, news, resource. And over the years, it's become a kind of signature project there, and we've been able to sort of bring thousands of new audiences to bear around issues of the Decade of Centenaries, particularly young people, to help them learn and understand more about that time. And we did that through the development of new resources like comic books, graphic novels, animations, and interactive iBooks. And I'm pleased to say that we've actually got a new graphic novel on the impact around partition, which will launch in the next few weeks as well. And all of that work has also led us to develop partnerships and partnership working with organisations right across the island, the likes of National Museums, Northern Ireland, Peroni, Liverpool Library, National Library of Ireland here, and also the Gallery of Photography Ireland, and to develop new projects and ways of working. And those projects have often been around using the past as a vehicle through which to explore issues, current issues, around who we are now, issues of culture and identity now, but also projecting into the future as well. And so it is with today's conference, in a way. So we're delighted to be working in partnership with the Gallery of Photography Ireland, and to bring sort of leading voices from across the island and internationally to bring and talk about some of the pertinent issues around equality and inclusion in that context, through the prism of the Decade of Centenaries, particularly as we approach the end of that period of time. And it's always been really important for us to partner with other organisations in our work and to make connections with the likes of Trish and Tanya and the Gallup photography team, and particularly on a cross-border basis. It's been sort of a large focus of our work, as Trish says, since 2018, so that we can share on a truly kind of island-wide basis. I want to thank the National Literary Heritage Fund and the Northern Ireland Office for their support for the Creative Centenaries project, which is allowing us to put this conference on today. And it's really nice to be back face to face. I haven't actually been in a conference room with people, a real live conference room with people for a few years now. So thank you all so much for coming along, and I'm pleased to see so many people joining in as well from home. We really want you to enjoy today's discussion. We hope you do. And please do use the hashtag #InOurOwnImage, that hashtag, and ask questions as we go through for the conference. So we'd like to hand you over now to our first panel this morning.
Yeah, and also if people are joining online, they can also use the hashtag and send in questions. Or if people want to send in questions, the speakers might be happy to answer them afterwards. And just finally, before we hand over to Tommy, we'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Department of Foreign Affairs Reconciliation Fund and the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media.
All of them.
They have funded a lot of artist programmes over the last 5 years, a lot of which we have worked on together. And this support is really important. The cross-border cultural links work with artists and community at a local level. And it's quite different to other funding. It's very process-based, and there's some artists here who've been funded through this and shown work in the borderlands to the people of the borderlands. And that's really important that these initiatives are supported. So we really, really deeply appreciate to these funders who fund these often quite mercurial projects that are very sensitive and very much affected by the changing political landscape. So we'd really like to say a big thank you to those funders, and also to take this opportunity to thank our own funders, the Arts Council and Dublin City Council. So thank you. By the phones, if everyone has their phones with them, could you please switch them to silent? Thank you.
Absolutely. So without further ado, we'll hand over to our first panel, and we'll let Tommy Graham from History Ireland introduce. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So welcome to the first session of the In Our Own Image conference, addressing the role of photography in recording history. First of all, I suppose I should introduce myself, Tommy Graham, editor of History Ireland magazine since its foundation in 1993. Now, as a magazine, not a journal, History Ireland was able to provide the format for the presentation of historical imagery to a wider public. But this was not a well-developed area at that time. The printed word was the medium of historians, and there was a tendency to recycle the same stock images in history publications if they were reproduced at all. Give you an example, I just distributed a few sample copies of History Ireland there, and that was to reward the early birds, by the way. And you'll all be expected to subscribe. No, that front cover image, absolutely brilliant image. That, as far as I know, that's the first time that's been seen widely. And the reason for that is it was taken by a French photojournalist, and it was sitting in French National Archives. And in the old days, that's where it would have remained. And what you have there is a marvellous image of anti-colonial solidarity. This is Margaret Buckmaster, a feminist and socialist. And we English protest. It's so eloquent. So I'm hoping that one's going to go viral, as they tend to do these days. So advances in digital technology, the internet, etc., has revolutionized the situation with a huge expansion in the range of images available and greater ease in their transmission. So people are rummaging through attics and whatever. I mean, private individuals are now able to scan stuff, put it up in the net, and it's made freely available. But this presents new challenges. Never has the need been greater to equip scholars and the general public with the necessary theory to utilise these visual resources to the full. So this conference is very timely indeed. Okay, now the format here is we're going to have 3 presentations, about 15 minutes each. I'm hoping people will stick to their time limit, because that'll give the audience a chance to ask a question or two. So we'll maybe have 1 or 2 questions after each presentation. Our third one will be virtual. tell you, it scares the hell living daylights out of me, that sort of thing. But I'm told there's a very, very good technological backup team here. Now, our first speaker is Fergal Fitzpatrick, head of the Department of Fine Art Media at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin. His current research project is the politics of the image, Ireland landscape and 19th century photography. And this morning he will present us with a problem with two-letter words, photographic archives and us. Fergal.
I'll go ahead.
Yep.
Morning, everyone. First of all, I just want to thank Trish and Tanya and Niall for the invitation to be here today. It's really nice to be in such esteemed company, giving papers and talking and listening and so on today. Also to Leanne and Katie and the tech team in the background who've been very helpful to this point. So, really just briefly, I need to begin with two qualifiers. First in-person conference in several years, so maybe I'm a bit rusty, forgive me if I am. But a couple of qualifiers to start with, which I think are necessary from my perspective anyway, which is, I know today we're speaking against a backdrop of images. We're awash with images emanating from a vicious war in Europe, and many of them are depressingly familiar, and I'm sure we're going to touch on that throughout today, directly or indirectly. I'm also conscious, given the theme of today and the range of speakers, and I know there's a wide range of people in the audience, that somebody very close to me gives me advice to remember, which is that the phrase "check your privilege" is not for me to ensure that my privilege is safe and intact. It's to acknowledge other dimensions of it. So with those two qualifiers out of the way, what I want to talk about today is, as Tommy mentioned, I've been looking at the politics of photography with a focus on 19th century representations in Ireland. But today what I want to talk about is something a little bit to do with the methodology, how we find ourselves looking at photographs and that process and so on. So to preface it with, I know there's a range of listeners in the audience and specialists and non-specialists. So if it gets a little bit jargonistic, I apologise. I hope it doesn't. But if it does, please feel free to pick at that in the questions afterwards, because I would like to keep it kind of open. So to move on, two simple questions are often asked, which is, one, what is the photograph of, 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 little two-letter word, and what do we think this photograph means? Again, W-E, we, what do we, us, another two-letter word. So the title was ever so slightly provocative, is that I'd like to look at those words, because continually in doing this kind of research work, you come back to that and you're forced to deal with that question of what is the photograph of and who are we, the we that looks at these photographs. Because this lies at the root of many debates around the photographic image and the complication there, locally in our current phase of national centenaries, and further afield as we look at the legacies of colonialism through the prism of globalised capitalism. And then in the familiar conversations, and I know many people in this room would be familiar with this territory for many years, the definitions of the archive are continually under pressure. So we have a hybrid version can sometimes seem to hover somewhere between the idea of the mid-19th century idea of collecting, collating, categorising, organising in buildings, rooms, and using technologies on one hand. And then on the other hand, we have an expanded kind of Foucauldian sense of the archive, which seems to represent all the things we do and say, you know, Michel Foucault's idea of the archive. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for this few minutes today, what I'm interested in terms of the archive is it as a site of curated collections of images and the process of their leaking and projecting ideas into the mainstream. And in this, the archive becomes a locus for developing shared understandings of these small words of we, us, and so on. So as individuals, we bring our purposes, our biases, our experiences, methodologies, and politics to each encounter with the archive. And the archive reveals what we are looking for within its holdings, showing us images of things that we're curious about. And these two-letter words bring us quite quickly to inevitable archival gaps and absences. So working to find, to constitute, or maybe reconstitute this sense of us drives the politics of conversations such as today's, and hopefully in a constructive way. So before I go further, maybe it's useful to share my own ideological biases in approaching photographic images, and they're fairly predictable and fairly simple. They're materialist and they're centre left. So far, so typical for somebody who teaches in an art school, but there they are. And for me, multiple influential writers and thinkers whose work has emerged over the last 100 years have continually reshaped the concepts of we, the audience, and the of in terms of image subjects. And what their work has in common is a recognition, for me, of the instability of the photographic image when we attempt to pin down its meaning, like a collector with a butterfly in a vitrine. So often the idea of the meaning of the photograph is fugitive, it's evasive, it's mutable, it slips. And I find that to be a useful characteristic to hold on to in this work. So we have people like Walter Benjamin, who many of you be familiar with, and his work helps us understand how the photograph can be understood simultaneously as a commodity, a mnemonic device, a poetic text, and a collapse of time and distance. And this polyvalence of the photographic image is an inherent part of its capacity to hold a contradiction in place, revealing the world in one respect while concealing other dimensions of the moment captured. This is Benjamin's emergent or dialectical image. Then we have Roland Barthes and his studium and punctum devices, guiding us into and out of sometimes ineffable aspects of our encounters with photographs. And as his work moved from a harder semiotic system of encoded meanings into the softer territory of camera lucida, the space for this momentary tear in the fabric of everyday perception again gives us fleeting space for insight, often fleeting and often personal. Susan Sontag taught us about the risk of compassion fatigue, as it was termed, in witnessing the suffering of others. And again, others equals not us. In her seminal book on photography, she argues for what she called an ecology of images, where the assault on our senses in a mediatized consumer society could be mitigated by ethical engagements with the visual, to manage the desensitizing power of explicit imagery. Now, she's writing in the 70s, but it's still true today. In her last book, Regarding the Pain of Others, Sontag acknowledged that there would be no such ecology, but that nor had we become automatically desensitized to imagery. So there was an optimistic note in a very difficult argument. Personally, I'm continually drawn back to John Tagg's analysis from the late 80s of the photograph in modernity. And Tagg writes, and I quote, "Photography as such has no identity. Its status as a technology varies with the power relations which invest it. Its nature as a practice depends on the institutions and agents which define it and set it to work. It functions as a mode of cultural production. Its function as a mode of cultural production is tied to definite conditions of existence, and its products are meaningful and legible only within the particular currencies they have. Its history has no unity. It is a flickering across a field of institutional spaces. It is this field we must study, not photography as such." So Tagg's flickering is not a natural or impartial process, though it sounds like something of nature. The images don't arbitrarily happen into institutional spaces. They are purposefully employed by individuals to particular ends at specific times. Now, Tagg was, in a particular place in a particular set of debates, and you can feel the kind of post-Marxist Foucauldian kind of informed language and so on. But it's a useful way, I think, sometimes to look at photographs. Not to forget the image itself and the semiotic charge and the meaning and the cargo on the image surface, but sometimes it's useful. Then Nicholas Mertzev, his concept of the right to look is an interesting one for me, which is it underpins the power relations of visual regimes preceding and shaping photographic cultures. He's talking about a human being's right to raise their head, to use their eyes, to look in a particular place at a particular time, and how that was dangerous and can still be dangerous in particular places and times. While Ariella Azoulay addresses the power dynamics and the political interoperation of photographer and subject. Now, in that connection, we have the subject of the photograph and the we of the audience and the photographer as in-between point, set up in a very taut, interdependent relationship, and that's kind of interesting to see play out in the conversations. Elizabeth Edwards and her colleague colleagues and associated writers in the various books she's written and published. They delineate the enmeshed historical relationships between museums and archives at the metropolitan centres and colonial pillage at their perceived edges of their world. And these analyses exert a particular and timely pressure on debates in recent years. And again, the archive and the museum are at the centre of this tension and this dialogue. Jacques Rancière argues that photography became an art, and I quote, by exploiting a double poetics of the image, by making its images simultaneously or separately two things, the legible testimony of a history written on faces or objects, on one hand, and pure blocks of visibility, impervious to any narrativization, any intersection of meaning, end quote. I find Rancière's proposition is helpful in understanding the positions adopted by George D.D. Huberman and his critics in their dispute over the presentation of images made inside Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1944. D.D. Huberman argues that when a representation works to mediate an event, it is undermined by the almost inevitable critical conclusion that it is inadequate when we compare what we see with what we know. And I quote, "Why is there such a difficulty? It is because we often ask too much or too little of the image. Ask too much of it, the whole truth, for example, and we will quickly be disappointed. The images are merely stolen shreds, bits of film," end quote. Gerard Wachmann, Elizabeth Pagnu and Claude Lanzmann argued against Huberman that the presentation of images in question from Auschwitz compounded the humiliation and dehumanization of the victims depicted, risking a totalizing collapse of the real into representation. That representation would be a substitute for the real, letting us off the hook ethically or politically. In this dark corner of photographic historiography, we find the difficult point where D.D. Huberman identifies, and I quote, "a simple image, inadequate but necessary, inexact but true." Now that debate between the two sides is unresolved, and I'm sure lots of people in this room have strong opinions on it, but it's interesting to consider just in this short narrative here. Each of the people I've mentioned here in this very short paper has taken photography seriously, and all in their different ways acknowledge the fugitive nature of photographic meaning. And so for me, what I would suggest is at best, and no matter how hard we work at it, the exercise of engaging with photographic images can give us a sliver, just a sliver, a cross-section. In Raymond Williams' City and the Country, in the foreword, this idea of the cross-section, the historical cross-section of an instant, in terms of what the lens captures in the split second, and the wider conditions shaping that historical moment. So with all of this scholarship, or all of these insights, or all of these smart people who've helped us through the years to understand these things, on a good day, I think if we can get a sliver of a cross-section of a momentary insight, it's helpful and it's good. So when we share these close readings that we are privileged to produce, their influence acts as a kind of a Brownian motion, molecules in the air of our shared culture. And I think all of this is important. I think it's necessary, I think it's constructive, and I think it's civilized. Some approaches, some scholars, some writers, some critics will attempt a totalizing, systematized framework, and sometimes that's useful. Others will offer the tools to develop more localized inflections, momentary encounters. Again, this sliver, this cross-section, this tear, this insight, this moment. I would argue that the consensus on the coordinates of our inquiry or the politics of its outcomes isn't particularly useful. But what I would say is, in an ever-widening climate of untrammeled authoritarian state violence in the West, built on a blasé, hateful disregard for the value of truth and rationality, we're reminded of the deep value of the modest, iterative process of noticing, of gathering and maintaining collections of statements, images, and objects. And in exploring what photographs are of and who we are in relation to them in our various encounters, I'm just arguing today that this slow work still matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Fergal. I'm right on time. Do we have any questions, one or two questions from the floor before we move on to the next speaker? If anyone would like to quiz Fergal? I tell you, you gather your thoughts, we can come back to you at the end. Now I'm going to move on to our next speaker, Joy Carey, currently works at the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland in the Preservation and Collections Management team as Digitisation Manager. So Joy is interested in the ethics of digital restoration when applied to digitised historic photographs. And this morning she will give us a short presentation on Hugh Annesley, 1831 to 1908, soldier, politician, horticulturist, photographer. Joy.
I had some slides prepared and just... Thank you very much. So good morning everybody, and thank you very much to the Gallery of Photography for inviting me here this morning. Coming down from Belfast to talk to you about a wonderful collection of early photographs that we hold there, and I'm really hoping you'll see something new today and something that will really inspire you. It's a very early 19th century photography. We have it at the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, and it's been taken by one of Ireland's earliest photographers of distinction, and they're very unknown, not very well known at the minute, Hugh Annesley, who was the 5th Earl of Castlewellan in County Down. And in this photograph on the left, you can see Hugh Annesley in about 1855 when he was 24, timing the exposure of a self-portrait. So it's my duty to introduce Prony, the place of deposit, before I continue. We're located in the Titanic Quarter now of Belfast. We used to be in Balmoral Avenue, but we're now in the Titanic Quarter in the shadow of the famous yellow cranes of the Harland and Wolff shipyard. And I love that photograph somebody's captured of the reflections in our building windows. So Prony is the official archive for Northern Ireland, and we hold records dating from 1219 up to the present day. We're the official place of deposit for public records of the Government of Northern Ireland, but also for a range of privately deposited records and archives, of which the Annesley papers that I'm talking about today are one. We identify and preserve records and archives of historical, social and cultural importance and make them available for the public. So the Annesley photographic collection at Prony consists of 36 albums of photographic prints. The first 9 albums consist mostly of Hugh Annesley's own photographs of army life, of the Castlewellan area, of his friends and relations taken between the mid-1850s and the end of the 1870s, and it's a selection from these early albums that I'll be showing you today. This is a self-portrait of Hugh, aged 25, when his output as a photographer was at its height, and having served as a young officer in the Scots Fusilier Guards. Hugh was the product of a long line of Annesleys who came to Ireland from Yorkshire during the late 1600s as landowners. In 1758, Hugh's ancestor William Annesley was awarded the peerage for reclaiming the land around Castlewellan and for building the town that stands at the castle gates. So it was originally named after him, it was Castle William, but then through the Irish dialect it has been changed to Castlewellan. In the early 1800s, about 150 families effectively owned County Down, and as one of those families, the Annesleys considered it necessary to show their wealth with the building of a castle. The smaller photograph on the slide shows Castlewellan Castle in the County Down estate, which was built between 1856 and 1858. The Scottish architect William Byrne designed the castle under the 4th Earl Annesley's order. In 1874, the 4th Earl, who was Hugh Annesley's elder brother, died unmarried, and the castle was passed to Hugh, and he became the 5th Earl. As well as enhancing the building, he was a very keen horticulturalist, and he's very well known as someone who introduced new species of trees and plants to the estate that he brought back from many of his travels abroad. This photo of the estate dates from 1874, so it was the year when Hugh became the Earl and the castle passed into his ownership. You can see his photographic tent there at the front of the image, where he would have prepared and developed his wet plate collodion glass negatives while out photographing. So here we have portraits of Hugh's older brother, who was the 4th Earl who built the castle, and of his mother Priscilla Cecilia. The fourth Earl built the castle, but he also managed to run through roughly £120,000, leaving a much mortgaged estate to his younger brother Hugh in 1874. On the right is their mother, who was by all accounts a very devout religious woman, and in her autobiography, Hugh's daughter Constance Malleson, who was an actress, revealed of her grandmother, "On Sundays she would stand all day on the lawn, distributing Bibles and religious tracts to the unfortunate trippers who flocked through the park to have a jolly time and to enjoy the beauty of the place." So after Hugh's education at Eton and then at Trinity College in Dublin, Hugh immediately entered the army aged 20. He served in the 43rd Light Infantry during the Kafir Wars, and I use his language, of 1851 to 1853 in South Africa. These still life photographs of some of his spoils of war date from this period in his military career. They're saltpaper prints produced from wet plate collodion negatives from the earliest two albums of photographs that we have. Under the centre photo, which shows an ivory ring, a necklace and an assegai, which was a light spear made for throwing, the annotation reads, "Taken from a dead Kafir by H.A. Hugh Annesley after a skirmish in Fuller's Hawk, the day poor W was killed." Not sure who poor W was. Below the skull, Hugh has written, "Found by H.A. in a kloof," which is a steep-sided ravine in South Africa, after a skirmish. Now, this wonderful image was taken in the Crimean War. Hugh joined the Scotch Fusilier Guards on return from South Africa, took part in the Crimean campaign of 1854. This photograph shows a large British military encampment. The image is reminiscent of similar photographs from the same conflict by much more well-known and celebrated photographers, such as Roger Fenton and James Robertson. And this photograph from the same conflict shows officers Ponsonby and Campbell, who were two aides-de-camp to Sir William Codrington, who was the Lieutenant General who commanded Hugh's brigade into the Battle of Alma, and Hugh received a bullet wound through his jaw during that battle. And there's a self-portrait in the collection showing Hugh on his return home from the Crimea with a bandaged facial wound. So some of the photographs Hugh Annesley took when he was stationed in the Curragh military camp in County Kildare, in Aldershot Barracks in Hampshire and at the Tower of London are some of the most aesthetically striking albumen prints from the collection. Here we have an Irish beggar boy photographed at Curragh camp and what looks to have been an impromptu practice of the Scots Fusilier Guard band drawing a crowd at the Tower of London in 1857. And this exceptional photograph of two rather ragged men sitting beside an elaborate piece of machinery designed for grinding knives is annotated by Hugh himself in the 5th album as the CD knife grinder. You can see the army huts in the background, and in comparison with some of the other photographs in the collection, this could have been taken in Aldershot or in the Curragh. Annesley's portraits are particularly striking. He took many of fellow officers and military personnel, and it was extremely difficult for me to select only a few to have time to show to you all today. And this image of a group of young military band members and drummer boys resonates with me as a mother of a 7-year-old boy myself, because I can't help feel but for the small boy on the left there, because he doesn't look at all ready to lead soldiers into battle. And this chess image, entitled Check, is very similar in composition to another photo which is displayed in the same album but credited to the eminent Crimean War photographer to Queen Victoria, Joseph Cundall. It's likely that Hugh Annesley was attempting to recreate a similar style of picture to contemporaries whom he admired. The man on the left is probably Hugh's younger brother Arthur Annesley, because there's other portraits of him in the albums. The albums also feature many subjects closer to home. The building of Castlewellan Castle has been recorded, and on the left here is the digging of the foundations, as well as images of the imposing Annesley residence that was situated in the foothills of the Mourne Mountains near Newcastle, which was Donard Lodge and the estate of Hugh's mother. The lodge suffered serious fire in 1941 and was unfortunately demolished completely in 1966, so it's great that we have this record of the property. Fine portraits are also evident in the Irish images, including interesting ones of the Annesley household staff and locals. Here depicted the Castlewellan village blacksmith and the housekeeper of the Annesley estate. And here we have the gamekeeper and the family valet. So Annesley retired from the military in 1860, having reached the rank of lieutenant colonel. From 1857 to 74, he was the Conservative MP for County Cavan, where they also owned land. He married twice, firstly to Mabel Markham in 1877, when he was 46 and she was 19. They had 2 children, one of whom, Lady Mabel Annesley, became a famous wood engraver and book illustrator, and his second marriage a year after the death of his first wife was to his first cousin, Priscilla Armitage Moore, in 1892, and at that time he was 61 and she was 22. They had 2 daughters, one of whom became the actress Constance Mallison. Much of his time during his later life was spent establishing the Arboretum at Castlewellan, which has been ranked as the finest in Ireland. In 1903, he wrote, at the behest of the Royal Agricultural Society, a botanical book illustrated by his own photographs of his garden, beautiful and rare trees and shrubs. And he died aged 77 at Castlewellan in 1908. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, George. Now, any questions there from the floor for Joy?
It's a much difficulty dealing with some of the more sensitive issues, and where are you as an organisation with that? You know, you sort of, or considered racist terms and the captions and things like that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one for us. I mean, because the people of that contemporary time would have used those words. Often they appear in records. You know, things like we have records of what's printed on the book as a mental asylum, and that's how we have to catalogue those and put that detail into our descriptions and everything. But yeah, we have to explain and interpret that for the modern audience, and just explain that things that were acceptable at that time obviously aren't acceptable today.
I mean, there's a problem with that, I feel. I mean, I got an email from a friend of mine who was at an exhibition of Hogarth images in London, you know, like including Harlot's Progress. But the information tag referred to sex workers.
Right.
Sorry, a sex worker's progress just doesn't have the same ring to it as Harlot's Progress. That's what the original image is called. I don't know. I mean, I think that this thing, that it can go a bit too far sometimes. This, you know, policing of language.
We have a Flickr photo stream where we put up a lot of our collections, and it's a good place to have a look if you're interested in what Prony collects in the photographic side of things. And I know that colleagues of mine that I know from the National Archives, for example, they have Flickr photo stream as well, and they've put up images that people have said have had racist language in them, but they just leave that there and let the kind of the comments that the public put underneath, and they often will have that debate themselves, and the institution doesn't have to step in, you know. But
well, that sounds better. That sounds more democratic,
yeah, exactly.
and practical
Exactly.
as well. Anyone, any comment on that? Yeah.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on the recent popularity in colorization of old images, and I guess the modern reinterpretation, and how that affects our engagement with that.
Yes, I know. I'm on the fence with that at the minute, and interestingly, I'm doing a degree course at the minute in preventive conservation. That's what my dissertation topic's going to be, in the digital restoration of historic images and just the way they're being reinterpreted and manipulated in different ways. And those manipulations are presented to the public as this is the historical record quite often. And I noticed that myself, even if you flick through Facebook, you see things that have been colorised, but quite often it can be at a period of time in historical photography where things might have been in colour, and you're not quite sure whether, well, is this being colorised recently or is this original colorisation? So I think there's a definite place for a lot more understanding and people having to describe and give information as to what has gone on to produce that image. And yeah, it has real issues and risk of misinterpretation by researchers.
It's a bit of a fad at the moment, I have to say. I mean,
yes,
I suspect it may just settle down and find its own level. I mean, there's no doubt that colorized images, you know, they're very pleasing to the eye. But I mean, if every single black and white photographs colorized, it does damage to the record, I think,
Yeah. And we have to think about the original intent of the artist, that they wouldn't have had that possibility. Would they have wanted it to be presented in colour or not? I mean, they could have selected particular compositions and lighting in order to produce a particular effect in the black and white palette. So yeah, it's a difficult one at the minute, and I think it's something that could be very much more explored and researched.
Yeah.
Just getting back to the sensitive nature of historical material and captioning, I think the best practice generally is perceived now to involve the communities that are
Yes.
the communities of origin. I work in the National Museum of Ireland. We've recently employed somebody from the Trafford community to look at our catalogues, to look at the terminology, and we're not eradicating the original way that the folk artists describe things, but we're augmenting it and adding to it. And that would be the same plan for our ethnographic collection as well. So really it is, you don't eradicate what that artist said,
Yeah.
but you also are that photographer, but you have to be sensitive to the people who are depicted in it. And I think,
Exactly,
imagine
yes.
the shock of, seeing that imagery if that is the community you come from, so I think there is a balance, and it's not an eradication of what that photographer said, but it is that sort of, and it's research and money that goes into it and making it all, really we have to find out historically what is there, and but there's living communities there, so really that would be, I think that's where museology is at the moment with regards to that cataloguing. The words we use, they're very powerful.
Yeah.
And it also comes into the curation as well, increasingly, we're hoping to do some co-curation with traveller community again. It's about what gets selected as well as the caption. That's really important about who picks what goes on the walls too.
So, with other photographers in Crimea being more renowned and wider known, will Hugh Ansley emerge as a photographer of importance, or was he a photographer there basically through privilege because he could afford to?
It's probably, I would hope the former, but there were other officers which he was obviously friendly with, who were also interested in photography at that time and would have taken similar images. There would have to be someone look upon it, in more of a qualitative sense, I would say. But yes, I would hope he does, because it's really an unexplored collection, and there's an awful lot of wonderful images there which just haven't been promoted in potentially the way that other collections have. Yeah. There's also a collection that we've got, the Kilmorey papers, which is from kind of the neighbouring landlord to Ansley, who was in Kilkeel, just outside Kilkeel in County Down, and he was also very interested in photography, and we do have some images and photographic albums in that collection, and you can see that Hugh Ansley and Lord Kilmorey would have gone out photographing together, so it'll be interesting to work out all those different connections. And I was really hoping to be able to discover what inspired Hugh Ansley to take up photography in the first place, but I expect, I was looking to see, could I find that he was a member of a particular society, for example, or would have attended a lecture perhaps on photography, but I imagine that it was just something in his social class that would have been available, and a new exciting technology, in the same way that teenagers today are all jumping on the most new exciting technology if they have the time and the money to be able to take that up.
Just before we move on to the next presentation, there's a question in the live chat here for Fergal from Emily Mark Fitzgerald, and she's wondering, as an educator, I wondered if you might comment on your experience of how your students encounter photography, and do they share the concept that you eloquently articulated of the fugitive nature of photography, or are they more inclined towards a positive idea of the photograph as information?
That's a good question. Thanks, Emily. I was thinking of Emily just as the question about colorization came up, because she wrote very well about it in the Irish Times not so long, about a year ago actually. I suppose just an initial response to that from where I sit, like the department I teach in sits inside a School of Fine Art, so were quite open with the students that were interested in this mutability, this fugitive, this continually displaced pursuit of meaning. Not that it's futile or that it's pointless, but that just in the spirit of what I was describing there, that these things are to be investigated. Now again, it's the privilege of being inside a contemporary art discourse where you're talking about how artists use photography rather than photographers with a capital P, and that's a whole other debate, and I'm not saying it's a binary. But to cut to the chase of Emily's question, I'm continually impressed by the sophistication with which all students, undergraduates up to masters and beyond, engage with these kinds of ideas. So for instance, I had a student a couple of years ago who happened to have a part-time job working as an on-site photographer for a nightclub in Temple Bar, and his job was to photograph punters from 2 a.m. till 5 a.m. having a good time, and then between 6 and 7 a.m. he would put them all up on Facebook and social feeds and so on. The idea being that when all these partygoers woke up and were having fried eggs in about 6 hours' time, they would then log in, start to see themselves, start to tag each other, and thereby market the nightclub and so on. Grant made a few bob, but his perception of how that process worked and how people engaged with it, and how knowing everybody was involved. And we're quite familiar with this now, I would say. But he was making the point that so many people in his world, kind of like the panopticon, they behave in public on the assumption that they're being photographed, and on the assumption that in 12 hours' time they're going to be viewed by themselves and their peers. And in that way, they have a very acute sense of how this traffic in photographs works. Now, there's a flip side, which I think creates social anxiety and all kinds of body image and senses of inadequacy and all of that kind of stuff. But going back to Emily's question, I think sometimes we don't give enough credit to people's capacity for negotiating these things in real time as they're experiencing them, as Joy suggests.
Okay, I think we I'm just looking at the time here. We need to move on to our final speaker here this morning. Mark Seeley is Director of Autograph and Professor of Photography, Rights and Representation at the London College of Communication, University of the Arts, London. Mark is interested in the relationship between art, photography and social change, identity politics, race and human rights. So this morning he will give a short presentation, When Harmony Went to Hell, Congo Dialogues, Alice Seeley Harris and Sami Balajoy. So Mark, are you there? Yes.
I hope so. I'm not quite sure where I am these days. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be invited into the conference today, and it's a shame couldn't be with you in person. Enjoyed the first two papers this morning, and hopefully I can just add a little bit of value to some of the things that have been said in terms of the archive. So what I'll do is, just to kind of context what I'm going to try and offer this morning, is just read for a short while, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes, depending how it goes, and then possibly show some images as I go along in the conversation. I think I've got a bit of technology here that helps me move a few images along. And at the end, there'll be a short film. I might not have time to show it all, so I might stop it. But anyway, I guess I'm engaged with the conversations of photography over many years now, approximately 30 or so. And my work really now examines how Western photographic practice has been used as a tool for creating Eurocentric violent visual regimes. It uses the central principle of decolonizing the camera, a process by which analysis of photography takes place within and against the political and violent reality of Western imperialism. Through this process, it explores issues of race, cultural erasure within photographic history, and through the direct analysis of photographic works, informed by two underlying questions. Firstly, has photography been a liberating device or an oppressive weapon that holds the viewer, producer, and citizen subject in a violent system of continual exposure? And secondly, what epistemic value has photography brought to our understanding of difference? Sorry. My curatorial research considers whether photographic works concerning visualizations of the other can produce different or new meanings when they are critically read through the prism of colonialism, its inherent forms of human negation, its temporalities, and its violence. This is done by locating and reading photographs within the ideologies of colonial time, space, and place. My curatorial work functions as a critical dialogue with colonial and imperial photographic histories and the social and visual spaces they occupy. Through the work I do in photographs, I argue that within these common types of racialized photographic spaces, we can analyze the variant levels of violence done in photography concerning the making of the other, and from that perspective, consider how these forms of violence worked in the service of Western colonial and imperial powers. Colonialism has been a dispossession of space, a deprivation of identity, and I'm quoting Bartlett from 2000. And it created a system of image production that maintained and disseminated its dehumanizing ideologies. At the center of my work lies the proposition that it is necessary to recognize photography as an active agent of Western colonizing authority at work on the body of the other, both in the past and in the present. It's only through this that we can begin to fully recognize the complexities and political impact of photographs in the visualization of racialized subjects. Throughout my work, I suggest that a photograph of a racialized subject must be located and then delocated from the racial and political time of its making, and not solely articulated by its descriptive, journalistic, or aesthetic artistic concerns. I maintain that it is only within the political and cultural location of a photograph that we can discover the coloniality at work within it, and then only then, through understanding this, can a process of inquiry begin into the nature of its colonial cultural coding. A key aspect of my thinking is not to allow photography's colonial past and its cultural legacies in the present to lie unchallenged and unagitated, or to be simply left as a given norm within the history of the medium. Decolonizing the photographic image is an act of unburdening it from the assumed normative, hegemonic colonial conditions present consciously or unconsciously in the moment of its original making and in its reading and displays. This is therefore a process of locating the primary conditions of racialized photographs' coloniality, and as such my work works within a form of Black cultural politics to destabilize the conditions, receptions, and processes of othering a subject within the history of photography. So the notion of destabilizing photography's historical past works through the lens of Stuart Hall's critical writing on race and representation, especially that concerning the British Black subject's construction within photography that he wrote in the 1980s. Of particular relevance to my work are his essays titled Reconstruction Work, Images of Post-War Black Settlement from 1984, and his essay New Ethnicities from 1988. In New Ethnicities, Stuart Hall theorizes a decisive turn against the Eurocentric stable and negative representations of the Black subject within Western visual culture. He also articulates a politics in which the unspoken and invisible subjects in post-Second World War Britain have challenged spaces of representation, and marks that moment that Black subjects begin to contest their historically fixed image. So building on the notion of the unspoken and the invisible Black subject within Western culture, and analyzing a series of complex photographic episodes drawn from various archives of Western photography, I make the case that such archives, in their myriad representative ways, are loaded with unspoken and culturally invisible subjects, and that the photographs within them work politically and aggressively as active agents locked within a colonial photographic paradigm. Hall claimed that the 1980s was a critical decade for Black British photography. I assert here that the 1990s should also be read as a transformative period that heralded the arrival of the other as photographer within the mainstream Western cultural institutions. Throughout my work, I consider the political and cultural conditions of both these decades as decisive periods in which the Black subject entered both the domain of representation and its international art markets. So the work I attempt to do is to examine, the visual and structural complexities at work within a given photograph's social and political formation, which I refer to as racial time. Racial time enables us to consider a photograph's function as a sign within the historical conditions concerning the relations of representation that Hall discussed in New Ethnicities. I employ the idea of racial time to signify a different but essential colonial temporality at work within a photograph. In New Ethnicities, Hall also presented the notion of the end of the essential Black subject. So if this is the case, then it marks an important conjuncture in history and photography where the other is brought into focus. Hall therefore shifts the cultural landscape in the understanding of the Black subject within Western visual culture, and I inquire within the research I present as to how the cultural landscape in the making of race has been historically constituted and how that landscape might be read today and in the future to produce new meanings. My work aims to locate, excavate, extract, and expose, and this is in line with Fergal's work, the slippery, ghost-like nature of the colonial in photography, so as to make the essence of the colonial legacy within photography and its dark epistemes more evident, more visible. I'm also the first to admit that this is not always possible. The images I've worked with in presenting exhibitions have been on the basis of extensive research into key photographic archives, such as those at Anti-Slavery International, the Bodleian Library, the Black Star Archives at Ryerson, Getty Images, Magnum Photos, etc., and the Imperial War Museum, to name a few. Analyzing this primary material revealed how Western regimes of scopic violence can be understood in the context of the racialized body, human rights, and photographic history. I'm also concerned with the concept of cultural erasure against the other, and this work is informed by a range of inquiries into history, photography, racial and cultural politics through the works, for example, of the historian Paul Gordon-Loran, Emmanuel Levinas, Frantz Fanon, Michel Foucault, Sven Lindquist, Paul Gilroy, Bell Hooks, Claudine Rankin, Judith Butler, Hannah Arendt, Gayatri Spivak, and, as already mentioned, Stuart Hall. Most of my research is not really through photographic historians, but an inquiry really into the work photographs do in culture. Levinas invites us to look into the face of the other as a duty, of obligation, and as a sign of our infinite and fundamental responsibility for the individual human. For Levinas, taking responsibility for the other is the ethical site where we locate our own humanity and morality. Using Levinas's philosophy as ethical responsibility, I argue that photography made through the prism of the colonial gaze has created such a wholly dehumanizing legacy of images of the colonialized subject that it may be impossible to rectify. Fanon's thoughts on decolonizing the mind of the colonized subject here map onto decolonizing photography and relate to the internalizing psychological damage that can occur to the human subject when constantly exposed to dehumanizing representations of blackness. Fanon's view of colonial violence suggests that violence generated by the oppressor is rejected with equal force. And with this in mind, analyzing photographs of the Black subject from the perspective of a decolonizing critique works as a process of political rejection of Eurocentric photographic practices. This opens up such photographs to different possible readings that unlock them from the fixity of the time of their making, which enables us to read, for example, Wayne Miller's photographs of Wayne Miller's photographs as a form of black performativity to white colonial privilege rather than empathetic documentary work. Power for Foucault is a function of the panopticanism in which the threat of permanent visibility causes subjects to become self-regulating and docile. In the dynamics of race and violence against the black body, such power is derived from controlling the black body through the assumed cultural authority of white rights to observe and display blackness. In Sven Lindqvist's key book, Exterminate All the Brutes, he writes, "The history of genocide is a travelogue through colonial time." This works as a reminder of the role of technology has played in Europe's domination and formation of its colonies. By representing the tragic consequences of those technological developments for colonized subjects, he reminds us of the importance of revisiting and decoding the narratives of history that sanitize colonial conquests. The legacies of colonialism and racism worry the history of photography. They enable fractures of enlightenment and humanitarian thought to haunt the present. Photography, when read within the context of European imperialism, has the capacity to function as a morbid reminder of the intense levels of cultural violence that was aimed at the other over centuries. Photographs need to be discussed not just as historical documents, but as images open to different interpretations, key moments in Europe's history, such as King Leopold's violent regime in the Congo, for example, or the complexity of agendas surrounding race at the end of the Second World War. This form of analysis allows us to read the nuances and gauge the power of the cultural and political forces at work within the history of photography, within the history of the genre, and to assess how these forces have impacted on the photographic constructions of race, the politics of human rights, identity formations, national narratives, and cultural memory. So I'll leave that idea of cultural memory just as an open question, and I think we can just play a short film now.
Pilot Officer Peter Thomas is the first African to be granted His Majesty's commission as a pilot in the Royal Air Force. Before the war, he was a civil servant in Lagos, the capital of Nigeria. When war broke out, he volunteered for the Royal Air Force and set his heart on being a pilot. Not every man can reach the highest standard of physical fitness and mental ability demanded of a pilot. Courage, industry, and tenacity are needed to finish the long and exacting course, and many fall out before the end. But Thomas kept at it, and at length came the proud day, proud both for him and for his unit, when he put up his wings.
Okay, I'm aware of time, so maybe we can pause there.
Pilot, able to fly any type of aircraft, and he's passed that most difficult of all tests, the course in blind flying. The colonial people have not shrunk from the difficult and arduous tasks of war, but from the beginning have shown that they are able and ready to take their place side by side with all the peoples of the empire in the battle for freedom.
Okay, thanks very much. Quite like the idea of flying blind and the battle for freedom. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. Now, any questions for Mark from the floor? Yeah. Just wait for the mic. Yeah.
So I'm just curious about the idea of what the work photos do in culture. So in the past, it makes sense because there were far less of them and there were less places to get them, and the archives now are obviously a great place for people to reference. But in the modern age, now everybody has a phone. Like, it's just an avalanche of photos all the time. What is the future of the representations of culture, and how will it be filtered out to what's important and what isn't?
Shall I answer?
Yep.
Thanks for the question. Yes, it's true. I mean, what is I think the key question for me has always been, what's the work that images do in culture? And that's not fixed, and that's not stable, and that's fluid. And you could argue that on one hand, as someone like Suli Rulik has been aware of, that we are surrounded in a kind of image sphere. Images now circulate the globe at a ridiculously fast rate, and that will and is having an impact. But also, I think it's a kind of, for me, it's the only metaphor in terms of talking about photography and its kind of circulation is the idea of a kind of jazz with it all. There's a kind of sense that things are going off at a tangent, that there's a rhythm to it, though, underneath, if we kind of look for it and feel for it. And at the same time, there are multiple players, but often within the band of kind of image making, there are key moments that kind of surface. And I think often in history, there are key moments that surface, and we have to ask ourselves the who, the what, the where, the when of what those key moments are about. And they're not just about conflict, they're about ownership and control and circulation and kind of, who's putting epistemic value, cultural value on images and the things that they do. So, for example, I would argue that, we're in a particular cultural turn at the moment around questions of race and representation. It's a kind of cultural turn that is in its third iteration in my lifetime, one in the 80s and 90s maybe, certainly one in the noughties, and another one now, where the kind of politics of thinking about, who's in front of the camera, who's behind the camera, who's narrating what. And I think the uncontrollable aspects of the work that photography does through, if you like, images, the capacity to make images in our pockets all the time, is both dynamic and at the same time both scary. But I think that's, to a degree, more of a kind of amplification of what photography's essentially always been about anyway.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to ask about, it was touched on a bit earlier about the people who wielded the camera and the people who had the power to wield the camera in the 19th century and early 20th century. And even sort of with the earlier presentation talking about how you can have the camera mixed with representing domestic life and then colonial violence, and with the images that you shown during the presentation, there's sort of wanting to disarm it and also wanting to show the violence as well, and that kind of double bind within it of wanting to not give the photographer who was wielding the power that same power still, and wanting to disarm that, but then also wanting to show the violence for what it was, and just to ask about that and that difficulty.
I think that is the question in many ways. How do you disarm, and how do you show, and how do you unpick? One of the things I've been very aware of is that we're not all. As you can probably tell, I'm interested in the idea of time, different temporalities, different ways in which we encounter things, different points in our lives where we get to see things and understand things and how they change as we also mature. I've said often that, when each time we visit an image, the image has changed, and so have we. So that's what I mean by it's non-fixity on a personal level. So each time I enter the kind of archive, things change. Sometimes I find them, deeply distressing. I used to think that I had a hardened sense of being able to look at certain things in life as you progress, kind of impact on your capacity to absorb difficult images. I've often said working in photography and focusing on the politics of race and representation has been damaging in some sense, having to look at the world through that kind of like lens. But I also think it's important that we keep on turning those things over, so that those meanings can at least be articulated and not just be felt as well. Although the whole praxis of that idea of responding to the way that images make you feel is really important, and again that changes on a kind of daily basis or an annual basis or a life cycle basis. So again, it's not a kind of fixed thing for me. And unfortunately or fortunately, those images do exist, and I can either look at them as incredible moments of helping us understand a kind of, if you like, a colonial mindset, or I could look at them as trying to understand what is an inherent crime scene. So all those things are at play within the kind of within the work that I guess I'm interested in trying to do.
Just wait for the mic, yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your papers. I suppose I'd just like to put a question to Mark. Mark, I had about 3 questions, but I'm going to focus on this one because you actually referenced it in the end. So where are those images? Are the images from the Congo part of that report that was put together by Sir Roger Casement? And that was my thought about the fact that they weren't destroyed, that the fact that they exist so that they have been documented. So could you tell us where the source of them and something of that context as you understand?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of began to follow the trail of King Leopold, the whole devastating genocide in the Congo. And that trail, of course, led me to the work of Alice Seeley Harris, and she was involved in and the archive was housed at the Anti-Slavery International offices in Brixton, which was just round the corner from where we were. Ironically, they were so close, it was ridiculous. And now the International Slavery Museum are looking after them with I'm hoping, a degree of care that those images need. I mean, Alice Seeley Harris for me was an important conversation to be had in the history of photography on several levels. One, in terms of gender, can't believe that she isn't held up as major force in photography, and especially with the impact that those of us that are working in universities understand impact studies, but the impact those photographs had was global in terms of helping people understand the atrocities that were happening in the Congo. The other thing that she'd been written out of history, because obviously the history of photography is incredibly biased in terms of its gender. And then really the idea of looking at that work through a kind of humanitarian visualizing human rights as an early activist, for me, they're just such an important body of work that it became impossible for me not to think about showing them. But the context of which I exhibited them with sorry, my mouth is very dry today. The context of showing them with Sami Baloji's work, a contemporary Congolese photographer, was also dealing with the idea of cultural amnesia. Was a very important co-joining for me with Alice and Sami's work. So they live now in the International Slavery Museum, as do the documents, as do the binders, and Richard Benjamin, the director of the museum, is looking after them.
We actually included them in a small room we did on Roger Casement as part of our 1916 centenary show. So
Yeah.
we went over to an Irishman, Aidan McQuaid was running Anti-Slavery
Correct.
International from Clough in Armagh. So he was running, and it was Angus Mitchell. So and now there's a new Casement statue. Not sure
Aidan was very, very, very supportive of the inquiry that I was making. I've lost touch with him.
So we allowed us to digitize the collection as well. So we made copies for Angus Mitchell.
Is that a question for me?
No, that was just a comment.
Oh, sorry.
I just got a text from Angus Mitchell about something totally different, by the way, just coincidentally. Now, I tell you, we're just coming to the end of the session here. Any questions for any of the speakers, any of the three speakers, before we wrap up? And we'll take just one or two before we break for lunch. Nobody there. Okay. I tell you, I'll just formally wrap up this session. I'd just like to thank our speakers here this morning, Joy Carey, Fergal Fitzpatrick and Mark Seeley, and you, the audience, for your attention. So we'll have a break for lunch, and we will resume. Was it 2 o'clock, is it? When do we resume? 10 past 1. Okay, so we've about an hour. Okay, see you all back here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. A pleasure to be with you.
So lunch is just served back in the